The shuttle bay of Calder Transport Services smelled like engine coolant and burnt sugar from the vending machine nobody had fixed in 3 years, which was exactly why Liora Venn chose it as a meeting place. Nobody who mattered would be caught dead here. That was the entire point. She stood just inside the hangar door in a traveling coat too plain for a woman worth several shipping fleets, her ears pinned flat with nerves she refused to let show anywhere else on her body. Across the bay, a man was elbow-deep in the intake manifold of a battered cargo shuttle, swearing at it in 3 languages, 2 of which he was clearly making up as he went. "Jace Calder," she said. He didn't look up. "If you're here about the Preston contract, I already told your assistant, I don't fly livestock and diplomats in the same cargo hold. Learned that lesson the hard way. I'm not here about livestock." Something in her voice made him straighten. He wiped his hands on a rag that had clearly given up on being useful weeks ago and turned around, and Liora watched the exact moment he recognized her. The flicker of surprise quickly smoothed into something more careful. "Ms. Venn." He said her name the way most people said your honor or ma'am, except there was no deference in it at all, just a kind of amused caution, like he was deciding whether she was here to complain about his flying. "You're a long way from the estate. I need a favor." "I don't do favors. I do invoices." "Then I need to hire you." That, at least, got his full attention. He leaned against the shuttle's landing strut, arms crossed, and studied her with the unhurried patience of a man who flew cargo for a living and had learned that most rich people's emergencies were not, in fact, emergencies. "For what?" "My family is holding a succession banquet in 4 days. My grandmother intends to announce my engagement to Corwin Ashgrave." Jace's eyebrows went up. Even out here on the colony rim, Venn and Ashgrave were names people recognized. 2 shipping dynasties that had spent 2 generations circling each other, sometimes as rivals, sometimes, when it was convenient, as potential family. "Congratulations? I don't want to marry him." "Then don't. It's not that simple." Leora's ears twitched, betraying the frustration she kept out of her voice. "My grandmother controls the board. If I refuse publicly, without an alternative, she'll frame it as immaturity, or worse, incapacity, and use it to justify appointing a steward to run my inheritance until I'm, in her words, ready. I need a reason. A believable one. Something she can't argue with in front of 400 witnesses. And that reason is me. You flew me here from the capital. Nobody in my family has met you. You're—" She gestured at him, searching for a word that wasn't insulting. "Unimpressed by rich people? I was going to say ordinary," she said. "But that works too." He laughed, short and surprised, like she'd caught him off guard. "So the plan is what, exactly? I show up to your fancy dinner and, what, profess my undying love. I need you to pretend we're mates. Just until dinner ends." She said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. "Hold my hand. Smile. Back up whatever story I tell them. That's all. 2 hours, maybe 3. Then you fly home and never have to think about my family again. And in exchange?" She named a number. Jace didn't flinch, exactly, but something behind his eyes recalculated. It was more than he'd make in a year hauling freight through 3 systems. Enough to finally replace the shuttle's aging drive core instead of nursing it along with prayers and duct tape. Enough to stop taking every job that came through the door regardless of how badly it smelled, figuratively or literally. "That's a lot of money for hand-holding. My family is very thorough," she said dryly. "They will ask questions. Where we met? Who said it first? What you—" She hesitated, just slightly. "What you like about me. You need to be convincing. You're asking me to lie to 400 rich bunnies for 3 hours. I'm asking you to act. I'm not an actor. I'm a pilot who occasionally hauls livestock he swore he wouldn't. You're the only option I have," Liora said, and for the first time some of the polish cracked, and he heard something underneath it, not desperation exactly, but close. Exhaustion. The particular tiredness of someone who had been fighting the same battle her whole life and was running out of new strategies. Please! Jace looked at her for a long moment. Rich, poised, untouchable Liora Venn, standing in his grease-stained hangar in a coat that probably cost more than his shuttle's last 3 repairs combined, asking him, please. Fine, he said. But I have rules. Name them. No physical stuff beyond what's necessary to sell it. I'm not groping anybody's granddaughter for a paycheck. Agreed. And when it's over, it's over. I'm not showing up to family Christmas. There will be no family Christmas, Liora said, with a flatness that suggested she found the idea faintly horrifying. This ends the moment my grandmother makes her announcement, or doesn't. Either way, you fly home that night. Deal. He held out a hand, and after only the briefest hesitation, she shook it. His grip was rough, calloused, entirely unlike the soft, manicured hands of every man her grandmother had ever paraded in front of her. One more thing, he said, not letting go quite yet. What's my name going to be in this story? Or do I get to keep the real one? Keep it, Liora said. It'll be easier to remember if it's true. Everything else will build from there. She had no idea, in that moment, how much of it would end up being true after all. Before she left the hangar, she paused at the door, coat pulled tight against the chill of the loading bay. One more thing, Mr. Calder. What made you say yes? Jace considered the question longer than she expected. Honestly? Not the money. I mean, the money helps. My drive core is held together with hope and spare parts at this point. But you didn't come in here acting like someone doing you a favor. You came in here like someone who'd already tried everything else and this was what was left. I've flown a lot of desperate people out of a lot of bad situations. Never one who could afford not to be in one. That's a strange thing to find compelling. I contain multitudes, he said, and she left without quite managing to hide her smile. They met twice more before the banquet, in increasingly implausible locations chosen entirely for their obscurity, a noodle stand 3 levels below the transit hub, a public garden nobody visited because the climate control was perpetually broken. Liora arrived each time with a list. We need an origin story, she said, spreading a data slate between them on a park bench that had seen better decades. Something specific enough to sound real, vague enough that we can't contradict each other. You flew with me from the capital. That's true. Why not just say that? Because if I say 3 weeks ago, my grandmother will ask why I didn't mention it sooner, and if I say longer than that, she'll ask why she's never heard your name. And either way she'll smell something wrong. Liora tapped the slate. We say 8 months. Long enough to be serious. Recent enough that I could plausibly have kept it quiet. 8 months. Jace repeated. Where? You flew me to the Meridian Conference. There was a mechanical delay. We were stuck on the tarmac for 6 hours. That actually happened, Jace said, surprised. Last spring. I know. I was there. She didn't look up from the slate, but her ears gave the smallest flick, the bunny equivalent, he was beginning to learn, of a blush. We can use it. Say that's where it started. A long delay, nothing to do but talk. It's mundane enough to be believable. Who fell for who first? You, Liora said immediately. Convenient. It's a better story. The unimpressed pilot, slowly won over by the Ice Queen Heiress. It plays into what they already expect of me, that I'm difficult to reach. It also means you get to have opinions about why, which will sound more natural coming from you than from me. Jace studied her for a second. You've thought about this a lot. I've had 4 days and a lifetime of practice constructing narratives my family will accept. She said it without self-pity, just fact, the way someone might describe a chronic joint ache they'd stopped noticing. What do you like about me, Jace? Excuse me? They'll ask you that. What do you love most about her? It's a standard interrogation question at every Venn family function, has been since I was 16 and brought a boy home who couldn't answer it and got humiliated in front of 40 relatives. She still hadn't looked up. You should have an answer ready. Something specific. Generic answers get picked apart. Jace leaned back, considering her properly for the first time since they'd sat down. Not the heiress, not the client, just the person across from him, spine too straight, jaw set, ears held with the particular rigidity of someone braced for impact. Your ears, he said. That got her attention. What? You've been doing this thing since we sat down. When you're annoyed, they go flat back. When you're thinking hard, one of them tips sideways, like you're listening to something only you can hear. And right now, talking about your family, they're doing this. He gestured vaguely. Tucking in thing. Like you're trying to make yourself smaller. Leora's hand went unconsciously to one ear, as if checking. That's not an answer to what you love, that's just an observation. Give me time. I've had 4 days too. He shrugged, easy, unbothered, and she found herself wondering how he managed that, the total absence of performance in a man about to become the centerpiece of hers. I'll come up with something better by dinner. But for now, that'll do. It's specific. Nobody could accuse you of feeding me a line. Fine, she said, and if her voice was slightly less steady than before, neither of them mentioned it. They spent another hour drilling details. The fictional first I love you, him, on the tarmac, 3 months in. Because she made him laugh so hard he'd said it before he meant to say anything at all. The fictional families neither had actually met, the fictional future they were supposedly building. By the time Liora stood to leave, she had a folder of lies organized with the same precision she brought to quarterly shipping reports. 4 days, she said. The banquet starts at 7. I'll send transport. I have my own ship, Ms. Venn. Liora, she corrected, testing the word like a shoe that didn't quite fit yet. If you're going to be my mate for the evening, you should probably use my name. Liora, he said, and something about the way he said it. Unhurried, a little amused, entirely unimpressed by the 4 generations of shipping wealth behind it, made her ears do the tucking thing again. Neither of them commented on that either. The day before the banquet, Liora sent a car. It arrived at the hangar unannounced, a sleek, silent thing entirely out of place among the freight haulers, and deposited a tailor, 2 assistants, and a garment bag that alone probably cost more than Jace's shuttle's last annual inspection. Absolutely not, Jace said, when he understood what was happening. You can't walk into a Venn banquet in a flight jacket, Liora said, arms crossed, standing just far enough back to supervise without getting fabric pins anywhere near her. My grandmother will read it as an insult before you've said a single word. I don't own anything that isn't a flight jacket. I'm aware. That's why the car came. He submitted, grudgingly, to being measured, pinned, and adjusted, complaining the entire time in a low mutter that made the tailor's assistants fight visible smiles. Liora sat in the corner of the hangar office, watching with an expression she probably thought was unreadable. It wasn't. Jace was starting to recognize the particular stillness she got when she was cataloging something she found more interesting than she wanted to admit. You're staring, he said, catching her eye in the mirror. I'm supervising. You're staring. I am making sure the tailor doesn't put you in anything that photographs badly, Liora said primly, and looked very deliberately at her data slate for the next several minutes. While the tailor worked, she ran him through a final round of drills, names of relatives he was likely to meet, a rough seating chart, the specific tone her grandmother used right before she was about to say something devastating. Very calm. Almost gentle. That's when you should be most afraid. She also, somewhat reluctantly, gave him a crash course in bunny etiquette. Never touch another bunny's ears without invitation, never comment on someone's foot thumping, and above all, never assume that any gesture performed in public carried the same weight it might among humans. Is there anything I should specifically avoid doing? Jace asked. Something that'll get me thrown out on sight? Liora hesitated, just slightly, in a way he filed away without understanding why. Just follow my lead, she said. I'll handle the details. It would occur to him later, on the balcony, that she'd never actually answered the question. The Venn estate at full banquet capacity was, Jace decided, one of the more intimidating things he'd encountered in a decade of flying cargo through some genuinely hostile corners of the galaxy. Chandeliers the size of his shuttle hung over a hall filled with more silk and jewelry than he'd seen collectively in his entire life, and every single person in the room seemed to know exactly who belonged and who didn't. He belonged the least. "Breathe," Liora murmured beside him, her hand tucked into the crook of his elbow with a grip that suggested she was the one who needed the reminder. She traded the plain traveling coat for a deep green gown that made her look like she'd been poured into the role of heiress her entire life, which, he supposed, she had. "You look like you're about to bolt for the exit. I fly cargo for a living. This is not my natural habitat. Nobody's natural habitat is a Venn family banquet. Some of us just have more practice pretending otherwise." Before he could respond, a woman appeared at Leora's elbow with the silent efficiency of someone who'd been eavesdropping from several meters away, silver-furred, sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of severe elegance that made Jace instantly understand where Liora had learned to hold her spine so straight. "Liora!" The woman's gaze slid to Jace, and did not warm. "You didn't mention you'd be bringing a guest." "Grandmother." Leora's grip on his arm tightened fractionally. "This is Jace Calder. My mate." The word landed in the small circle of nearby relatives like a dropped glass. Conversations paused. Ears turned. Somewhere to his left, a young man in an ashgrave-crested jacket went very still. "Your mate," Leora's grandmother repeated, in the careful tone of someone recalculating an entire evening's plans in real time. "How extraordinary that this is the first I'm hearing of it. I wanted to be certain before I said anything," Liora said smoothly. "You've always said not to bring home anything I'm not prepared to keep." It was, Jace thought, a genuinely excellent line, delivered with the exact right blend of deference and defiance. He filed the technique away for later, not that he'd have much use for it hauling freight, but it was impressive craftsmanship all the same. "And you're prepared to keep this?" Her grandmother's eyes swept over him, cataloging the absence of any Venn-appropriate polish, landing with particular disdain on the small grease stain he hadn't quite gotten out of his cuff. "A pilot." "A pilot," Liora agreed, "who's flown further and built more with his own two hands than half the men you've paraded in front of me. I'd think you'd approve of self-made." Her grandmother's mouth thinned into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We'll discuss this at dinner." She swept away, silver skirts trailing, already gathering a cluster of aunts and cousins in her wake like a storm front collecting debris. "That went well," Jace said. "That went exactly as expected," Liora said, but her ears had gone flat again, and this time he didn't need her to tell him what it meant. Dinner, it turned out, was less a meal than a tribunal. Jace found himself seated between Liora and a cousin named Petra who had the unnerving habit of asking questions in the tone of someone already certain she knew the answer, hoping only to catch him in a lie. "So where did you two meet?" Petra asked, swirling wine she'd barely touched. "Meridian Conference, about 8 months back," Jace said, exactly as rehearsed. "Mechanical delay on the tarmac. 6 hours, nothing to do but talk." "How romantic," Petra said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "And who said it first?" "The 3 words, I mean." Jace glanced at Liora, who was watching him with an expression carefully arranged into fond amusement, though he could see the tension in the set of her shoulders. "Me," he said. 3 months in. She'd made some comment about cargo manifests that shouldn't have been funny, and it just came out. Surprised both of us. "How embarrassing for you," said a voice from further down the table, the ash-grave heir, Corwin, leaning forward with the particular smugness of a man who had never once in his life doubted his own worth. "Blurting it out on a tarmac like a teenager." "I've made worse mistakes," Jace said easily. "That one I don't regret." Leora's foot found his under the table, a small, sharp pressure that he was fairly sure was meant as a warning, though it didn't feel like disapproval. If anything, when he glanced at her, The corner of her mouth had softened in something that looked almost like it wanted to be a real smile. "What do you love most about her?" Petra pressed, clearly enjoying herself now. "Go on. Grandmother always likes to hear the specifics." The table quieted. Jace felt the weight of it, dozens of Venn relatives leaning almost imperceptibly closer, waiting for him to fumble the way. He now understood. Every previous suitor apparently had. He looked at Liora. Really looked at her, the way he had in the broken-down garden 4 days ago, and found that the answer had grown since then, the way things did when you actually paid attention. "Her ears," he said again, but this time he didn't stop there. "She thinks she's unreadable. Spends a lot of energy on it, actually, keeping that composure locked down so nobody gets to see what she's really thinking. But her ears give her away every time. They go flat when she's furious and doesn't want to show it. They tuck in when she's protecting herself, which is more often than she'd probably like anyone to know. And there's this thing they do." He gestured toward her and watched, fascinated, as one of her ears twitched exactly the way he was about to describe. Right now, actually, when she's embarrassed. They go pink at the base. A small, startled silence. "That's not what I asked," Petra said, though with noticeably less bite. "You asked what I love most? That's it. Everyone in this family sees the version of her she's built to survive you all. I like the parts underneath. The sharp remarks that are really just kindness she doesn't know how to say plainly. The way she'd rather insult someone than admit she's worried about them." He shrugged, like it wasn't a big admission, though something in his chest suggested otherwise. "That's what I love most. The parts she doesn't perform." Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. Leora's hand resting on the table between them had gone very still. Then, slowly, without seeming to decide to do it, she leaned into his shoulder, both arms wrapping around his in a gesture that drew a soft, collective intake of breath from the older relatives nearby, and rested her head against him. "He's terrible at compliments," she said, voice a little unsteady. "You'd think a pilot would have better lines." "I've had 4 days of practice," Jace said. "Give me time." Under the table, something warm and impossibly soft pressed against his leg. Her tail, he realized, close enough now that he could feel it through the fabric of his trousers, a deliberate, lingering pressure that made his pulse do something complicated. He had no idea what it meant. He only knew that Leora's grandmother, watching from the head of the table with sharp, assessing eyes, had gone very quiet indeed. An uncle further down the table, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, introduced earlier as someone senior in the company's logistics division, leaned in with the air of a man who considered himself the family's unofficial fact-checker. "If you've been together 8 months, Mr. Calder, you must have met the rest of the family by now. Or at least heard the names." "Liora mentioned a few," Jace said carefully. "Though I'll admit the org chart of this family is more complicated than most of the supply routes I fly." That earned a genuine laugh from several people at the table, including, notably, the uncle himself. "Fair," he admitted. "We're a lot. What does a pilot make of all this, then? Bit different from your usual crowd, I'd imagine." "Honestly, most of my usual crowd doesn't interrogate me over the salad course," Jace said, and Liora, beside him, made a small, choke sound that might have been a laugh she was trying very hard to suppress. "We're thorough," the uncle said, unbothered. "It's kept this family's business intact for 4 generations. You'll forgive us for extending the same rigor to my niece's choice of partner. I'd be more worried if you didn't," Jace said, and meant it. Whatever else this family was, they clearly loved her enough to interrogate anyone who came near her, a fact that struck him, watching Leora's tightly held shoulders slowly begin to ease beside him, as more complicated than she probably wanted to admit. Nobody had told Jace that bunnies communicated in a language mostly invisible to humans. Not on purpose, exactly, but through 1,000 small physical signals that carried the weight of full sentences. He learned it slowly, over the course of the meal, the way you learn a new language by immersion, badly, and mostly by watching for reactions he didn't understand. Liora fed him from her own plate at one point, a small, unremarkable-looking pastry that she insisted he try, holding it up to his mouth with her fingers rather than passing him the plate. It struck him as odd, mostly because of the way three separate relatives visibly reacted, one of the older aunts actually setting down her fork. He didn't know what it meant. He ate the pastry. It was good. He didn't know, either, what it meant when Leora's ears turned toward him every time he spoke, tracking his voice across the table even mid-conversation with someone else, or that her foot, still pressed against his beneath the tablecloth, gave a small, involuntary thump whenever he said something that made her laugh. He definitely didn't understand, though he noticed it, sharp and immediate. The flash of something dark and possessive that crossed Leora's face when her cousin Ren, sharp-featured and clearly enjoying the drama of the evening, leaned across the table to ask him what a human pilot found so appealing about Colony Rim bunny girls. "I wasn't aware there was a general category," Jace said. "I only know the one." "Oh, come on," Ren said, resting her chin on her hand, tail flicking with obvious interest. "You must have noticed. We're a very tactile species." "I'm sure Leora's been very attentive." Ren. Leora's voice cut through the table like a blade, sharper than anything she'd said all evening, including to her grandmother. "That's enough. I'm just making conversation. You're flirting with my maid at my family's banquet. Pick a different hobby." The words came out fast, unguarded, with none of the careful performance she'd maintained all night, and Jace watched, fascinated, as Leora seemed to realize a half-second too late exactly how much genuine heat had been in her voice. Her ears went pink at the base again, the tell he'd described not 20 minutes earlier, and she reached for her wine glass with the particular focus of someone trying very hard to look unbothered. Ren, delighted, raised both eyebrows and said nothing further, which was somehow worse. Under the table, Leora's tail pressed harder against his leg. Jace didn't know what any of it meant. But he was starting to suspect it meant something, and that whatever it was, Liora hadn't fully caught up to it herself. Later, dessert was served. Something layered and citrus bright that Liora barely touched, too busy fielding a fresh round of questions from an aunt on her mother's side who wanted to know, with the particular delicacy of someone who did not intend to be delicate at all, whether children were part of the 5-year plan. Liora deflected with the ease of long practice, but Jace noticed her ears had gone rigid again, braced the way they'd been at the start of the evening, and without quite deciding to, he reached under the table and found her hand. She startled, just slightly, then laced her fingers through his and didn't let go for the rest of the course. "You don't have to answer that," he said quietly, beneath the noise of the table. "I know." Her voice was steadier for having said it. "It's just easier when I'm not the only one holding still through it. I can do still. Stillness is basically my whole job. You'd be amazed how much of flying cargo is just waiting patiently for something to stop being on fire." That, finally, got a real laugh out of her, unguarded, too loud for the room, quickly smothered behind her free hand, but real. 2 seats down, her grandmother's eyes flicked toward the sound, sharp and assessing, and did not look away again for the rest of the meal. The trouble, when it came from exactly where Jace expected it, Corwin Ashgrave, 3 glasses of wine deep and visibly tired of being upstaged by a man who flew cargo for a living. "I don't buy it," Corwin announced, loud enough to draw the attention of the surrounding tables. 8 months, and none of us have heard a whisper. No public appearances. No introductions. It's convenient, don't you think, that this relationship surfaces exactly when Liora needs an excuse to avoid an arrangement that's good for her family? The hall went quiet in the particular way that meant everyone was listening while pretending not to. "I don't need an excuse," Liora said, voice tight. "I need to not be handed to you like a shipping contract." "Careful," her grandmother said from the head of the table, though it wasn't clear who the warning was for. "It's a fair question," Corwin pressed, standing now, drawing himself up to his full, well-tailored height. "Prove it. Right here. If this is real, if he's really your mate, then it should mean something more than convenient timing. I don't answer to you, Liora said. You don't have to. Corwin's gaze slid to Jace, cold and evaluating. He does. Go on, pilot. Tell us why anyone should believe a word of this. Or is the money running out on your performance? The room held its breath. Jace felt Liora tense beside him, felt the exact moment her carefully constructed composure began to genuinely crack, not from embarrassment this time but from something rawer, the particular exhaustion of a woman who'd spent her entire life being auctioned off in increasingly elegant ways and had run out of new arguments against it. He stood. I'm not going to prove anything to you, he said, and his voice, when it came, was entirely steady. No performance in it at all, just plain fact, delivered the same way he'd talk a nervous passenger through turbulence. Because this was never about convincing you. You want proof that this is real? Fine. Here it is. Liora is not a shipping contract. She's not a merger or an asset, or a prize you get to claim because your families have been circling each other for 2 generations. She's a person, and she gets to choose who she spends her life with, and if that person isn't you, that's not a failure of the arrangement. That's just the truth. That's not an answer, Corwin said, though with noticeably less confidence. It's the only one that matters. Jace looked around the hall, at 400 faces watching the collapse of a plan he'd been paid to execute, and found, somewhere in the last 3 hours, that he'd stopped caring about the payment entirely. I don't know what your family's traditions say about mates, and honestly, most of tonight has gone straight over my head. But I know this. If being her mate means standing here and telling every single one of you that she doesn't belong to anyone, that she gets to run her own company and choose her own life and marry whoever she actually wants, including nobody, then I'll take the title gladly. Payment or not. I don't care anymore whether you believe it. He sat back down. The hall was utterly silent. Liora was staring at him, her eyes bright and her mouth slightly open, ears pinned all the way forward in an expression he hadn't seen from her all night, not composed, not performing, just entirely, nakedly stunned. Jace, she started. Enough, said her grandmother, rising from the head of the table, and something in the old woman's voice had shifted, though it was impossible to tell yet toward what. Every eye in the hall turned to the head of the table. Leora's grandmother stood with the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades learning to command a room without raising her voice, and when she finally spoke, it was to Liora, not to Corwin, not to Jace. I had intended, the old woman said, to announce your engagement to the Ashgrave heir tonight. To formalize a merger this family has been circling for 2 generations, and to ensure the company's future was, as I saw it, secured. Grandmother, I'm not finished. She held up a hand, and Liora, to Jace's surprise, actually stopped talking. I have spent your entire life treating you like an asset to be protected rather than a woman to be trusted. I told myself it was love. Perhaps it was. It was also, I think, cowardice, easier to arrange your future than to trust you to build one. Her gaze moved briefly to Jace, sharp and assessing. I still don't know what to make of your pilot. But I know a man performing for money when I see one, and whatever that was, it wasn't a performance. A murmur ran through the hall. I am not announcing an engagement tonight, Leora's grandmother continued. I am announcing that my granddaughter will inherit this company on her own terms, on her own timeline, and she will choose her own future, mate, business, and otherwise, without further interference from this family. Is that understood? Nobody argued. Corwin, red-faced and humiliated, sat down without another word. Somewhere near the back of the hall, Wren was grinning like she'd been waiting her whole life to watch this exact scene unfold. Liora rose from her seat, visibly shaking, and for a moment Jace thought she might simply walk out, vanish into the night the way she probably had 100 times before, alone, having won a battle that had cost her everything to fight. Instead, she looked at him. Walk with me, she said. There's a balcony. The night air outside was sharp and clean after the crowded heat of the hall, and Liora leaned against the balcony railing like something had finally let go of her spine. "You didn't have to do that," she said, not looking at him. "The speech. You could have just backed up whatever I said and left it there. That was more than the job required." "I know. So why?" Jace came to stand beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Below them, the estate gardens spread out in careful, manicured darkness, and somewhere in the hall behind them, the party was slowly, awkwardly, resuming. "Because it stopped being about the job somewhere around the tarmac story," he said. "I don't know exactly when. Maybe when you told me about your ears. Maybe when Ren started flirting with me and you looked like you wanted to throw your wine at her." Liora made a small, embarrassed sound. "I did not. You absolutely did." He was smiling, but gently. "Liora, the contract's over. Your grandmother made her call. Nobody's watching us anymore. You don't have to hold my hand, or compliment me, or pretend to care. It's done." "I know," she said. She didn't let go of his hand. Jace looked down at their joined fingers, then back up at her. "Your hand's still gripping mine." Leora's ears went pink at the base. That tell again, unmistakable now, and this time there was no audience to perform for, no grandmother to convince, no 400 witnesses to satisfy. Just the two of them, and the quiet, and the truth she'd apparently been avoiding all evening. "There's something I didn't explain," she said, staring very hard at the garden below. "About tonight. About earlier. At dinner. The tail thing," Jace said. "I did notice that. I have no idea what it meant, for the record. Among my people, that gesture isn't casual. It's not something you do to sell a story, or convince a room full of relatives. Pressing my tail against someone during a meal, feeding someone from my own plate, those are..." She took a breath. "Those are declarations. Sincere ones? Reserved for mates. Real ones? I wasn't performing that. I couldn't have, even if I'd wanted to. It's not something you fake convincingly. My body just did it. Because it wanted to." Jace was quiet for a moment, processing. "So when you told your cousin to stop flirting with me, that wasn't performance either?" Liora admitted, finally looking at him. "None of it was, by the end. I think I stopped acting sometime around when you described my ears to the entire table like it was the easiest thing in the world to notice. Nobody's ever bothered to notice before." "Not really." Her voice caught. "I'm sorry. You didn't sign up for any of this. You signed up for 3 hours and a paycheck, and instead you got dragged into whatever this actually is. For what it's worth," Jace said, "my speech wasn't an act either. Not by the end. I meant every word of it. Maybe I meant it before I even understood I meant it." Leora's breath caught, ears tilting toward him the way he now understood meant she was listening with everything she had. "So where does that leave us?" she asked. "I don't know your customs," Jace said. "I don't know what a tail press means, exactly, or what I'm supposed to do about it. But I know I don't want to fly home tonight and pretend the last 4 days were just a job. I know I like the parts of you that aren't performing. And I know that whatever this is, I'd like to find out what it's called properly, if you're willing to teach me." For a long moment, Liora simply looked at him, really looked, the way she had at dinner when he described her ears, like she was recalibrating everything she thought she knew about how this evening would end. Then she stepped closer, and this time, when her tail brushed against him, there was no table to hide it under, no story to sell. Just her, choosing it, plainly and without an audience. "I'd like that," she said. "Very much." They returned to the hall hand in hand, and if anyone noticed that neither of them had bothered to smooth their expressions back into anything resembling composure, nobody said so. The party had mostly recovered its rhythm, conversation swelling back up around the scandal of the evening the way water closes over a dropped stone. Leora's grandmother found them near the doorway, her sharp eyes moving between their joined hands and the particular pink flush still lingering at the base of Leora's ears. Well, the old woman said, in the dry tone of someone who had clearly done the math already and simply wanted to hear it confirmed aloud. Are you two still pretending? Liora looked at Jace. He looked back, and something passed between them that needed no translation, human or otherwise. No rehearsed line, no carefully built story, nothing either of them had practiced in a broken-down garden 4 days ago. Her ears glowed pink. Her foot thumped once softly against the polished floor, not a warning this time, not nerves, but something closer to certainty. Not anymore, she said. Her grandmother's mouth curved, not quite into a smile, but close enough. Good, she said. The real ones are always more trouble to arrange, but they last longer. She swept off into the crowd, already composing whatever story she would tell the rest of the family, and Liora turned to Jace with something bright and unguarded in her expression, the version of her he was beginning to understand, that hardly anyone in this hall had ever actually been allowed to see. So, she said, about that paycheck. Keep it, Jace said. Consider it a deposit. I intend to be very inconvenient to your family for a long time. Liora laughed. A real laugh, unpolished and a little too loud for the room, the kind she'd probably spent years learning to suppress in exactly these surroundings, and pressed her tail against his leg one more time, deliberately, sincerely, with absolutely no one left to convince but him. Good, she said. I think I'd like that very much. Outside, beyond the tall windows of the banquet hall, the colony's twin moons hung low over the gardens, indifferent to shipping empires and succession banquets and the particular, quiet miracle of two people who'd started the evening telling lies and ended it, somehow, having told each other nothing but the truth. The hangar smelled the same, engine coolant, burnt sugar from the still broken vending machine. But the shuttle in the bay was new, or new enough, a mid-range hauler with a drive core Jace had bought outright instead of nursing along with prayers, courtesy of a paycheck he'd initially refused and then, at Leora's insistence, accepted as back pay for services still being rendered. You're doing the thing again, Liora said from the doorway, arms full of paperwork she'd insisted on bringing to what was supposed to be a lunch, not a board meeting. What thing? Talking to the ship instead of me. She's temperamental. Requires attention. He wiped his hands on a rag that had, against all odds, gotten marginally cleaner in the last 3 weeks. Unlike some people, who apparently cannot leave company paperwork at the office for one afternoon. The office followed me. Liora set the folder down with more force than necessary, ears flicking in a way he now recognized instantly as irritation aimed at her grandmother's board rather than at him. Apparently inheriting the company on my own terms still involves an alarming quantity of quarterly shipping manifests. Welcome to my world. He crossed the hangar and kissed her, easy and unhurried, the way he'd been doing for 3 weeks now without either of them bothering to make a formal announcement about it, mostly because the entire Venn family had already assumed it and Liora, for once, hadn't bothered to correct them. You could always hire a pilot to help you file them. I hear there's a reasonably priced one on the colony rim. Reasonably priced. That's generous. I gave you a discount. Loyalty program. Her tail brushed against his leg, not beneath a banquet table this time, not for an audience of 400 relatives, just because she wanted to. And Jace decided, watching her ears go the particular soft pink he'd come to think of as entirely his to notice, that whatever this arrangement was called now, contract or courtship or something without a tidy name yet, he had no plans of letting the job end. Not anymore, he murmured, mostly to himself, and Liora, catching it, smiled like she'd been waiting 3 weeks for him to say it back to her properly.